The humid air of Oak Ridge, Virginia, hung heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and drying river mud. Samira Vance stood on her porch, her skin the color of deep mahogany against the pale yellow paint of the Victorian railings. At 62, she moved with a deliberate grace, the kind earned from 30 years of pacing hardwood classroom floors, teaching teenagers that history wasn't just dates, but a living, breathing monster. It had been exactly 1 year since Elias was laid in the red clay earth. Elias Vance, the town's silver-tongued defense attorney, the man who could convince a jury that the devil was just a misunderstood businessman. He was her rock, her protector, and for 40 years, the only person who knew the jagged edges of her soul. "Time to let the light in, Elias," she whispered to the empty porch. The house was too quiet. It was a grand, drafty thing, a legacy house, as the locals called it. Elias had bought it for her as a wedding gift in 1984, claiming a woman of her stature deserved a fortress. But today, it felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. Samira pushed open the heavy oak doors of his study. The room smelled of old parchment, expensive bourbon, and the faint, lingering ghost of pipe tobacco. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sun. This room was supposed to become a community literacy center, her final project, a way to give back to the neighborhood kids who saw books as a luxury they couldn't afford. She began with the bookshelves. Thousands of legal tomes, Black's Law Dictionary, volumes of Virginia state codes, and leather-bound case files. She packed them into cardboard boxes, her joints popping with every bend. By 4 p.m., the room was mostly stripped, but as she dragged a heavy Persian rug, a deep crimson weave Elias had obsessed over, the corner caught on a loose floorboard. Thump! The sound was hollow, not the solid thud of a foundation, but the echo of a void. Samira knelt, her knees groaning. She pried at the board with a letter opener. It gave way with a screech of rusted nails. Beneath the floor sat a steel lockbox, weathered and gray, embossed with a seal she didn't recognize, a stylized phoenix rising from a bed of thorns. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Elias never mentioned a safe under the floor. He had a state-of-the-art vault in the basement for his clients' jewelry and deeds. Why hide this here? She tried his birthday. Denied. Their anniversary. Denied. Then she paused. She tried a date she rarely spoke of. April 4th, 68. The day Dr. King was assassinated, and the day her childhood home in Georgia had burned to the ground. Click. Inside the box were dozens of microcassette tapes and a manila folder thick with photographs. Samira pulled out an old Sony pocket recorder that sat atop the tapes. She popped in a cassette labeled Sterling, The Bridge Project. She pressed play. Static hissed for 3 seconds, then a voice filled the room. It was Elias, but not the Elias she knew. His voice wasn't the warm baritone comfort she fell asleep to. It was cold, razor sharp, lethal. "I have the bank transfers, Julian," Elias's voice said on the tape. $200,000 moved from the city's infrastructure fund into your private offshore account. The bridge was built with subpar concrete. If those supports crack, the blood is on your hands. But the evidence? The evidence stays in my pocket, as long as you approve the rezoning for the West Side development. My clients want that land, Julian. Don't make me bury you." Samira gasped, dropping the recorder. It clattered on the hardwood, Elias's voice continuing to dictate terms of a shakedown. Her husband, the pillar of the Black Bar Association, the man who marched for civil rights, was a ghost broker. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a puppeteer. He didn't defend the law, he owned the people who wrote it. "Oh, Elias," she choked out. "What did you do?" Trembling, she reached for the manila folder. It was labeled Project Phoenix. She expected more legal documents. Instead, she found black and white surveillance photos. They were old, grainy, high-contrast shots from the late 60s. One photo made her blood turn to ice. It was a shot of a small, burning house in rural Georgia. In the foreground, a 6-year-old girl with braided hair stood in a nightshirt, her face smeared with soot, eyes wide with a trauma so deep it looked like death. "That's me," Samira whispered. She flipped the page. A birth certificate for Margot Hines. A death certificate for David and Sarah Hines, her biological parents. But then she saw a document that shattered her reality. It was a ledger of payments made by Elias Vance's father, Thaddeus Vance, to a group of men in 1968. The memo line on the check read, "For the clearing of the Hines property." Elias's father had paid for the fire. The Vance family fortune was built on the ashes of her biological family. The deeper she dug, the worse it became. She found a typed letter, dated 1982, 2 years before they married. It was Elias's handwriting. "I found her, Father. The Hines girl survived. She's living in South Carolina under the name Samira. She remembers nothing of the night. Her mind has blocked the trauma. I will do as we discussed. I will bring her into our circle. I will marry her. It is the only way to ensure she never talks to the feds, and the only way to keep the Sterling family and the others from finishing the job. I will be her cage, and she will think it is a castle. This is my penance." Samira felt the room spin. Every "I love you," every anniversary gift, every protective hug when she had nightmares about smoke, it was all a calculated move in a long-term containment strategy. She wasn't his wife. She was his project. He had spent 40 years blackmailing the other men involved in the fire, men who had now become the elite of Oak Ridge, just to keep them from realizing that Samira was Margot Hines. He held their secrets to keep her safe, yes, but also to keep his own family's sins buried in the dark. A sharp knock at the front door echoed through the house. Samira froze. She scrambled to shove the tapes back into the hole, but her hands were shaking too violently. She managed to slide the rug back over the opening just as the heavy front door creaked open. "Samira, you in there, honey? I saw the lights on." It was a voice she knew well. Julian Sterling, the Kansas Troon, sheriff. The man she had just heard Elias blackmailing on the tape. Samira wiped her eyes, forced her breathing to slow, and stepped out into the hallway. Julian stood in the foyer, his uniform crisp, his silver badge gleaming under the hall lights. He held a basket of muffins, a peace offering from his wife. "Julian," Samira said, her voice a fragile mask of southern politeness. "You caught me in the middle of packing. It's a mess." Julian stepped further into the house, his eyes scanning the hallway, lingering a second too long on the study door. 1 year today, isn't it? Elias was a good man. This town feels smaller without him. He walked toward her, his boots clicking with a rhythmic, predatory authority. "I heard you were thinking of opening a school here. That's noble. But you know, Samira, old houses hold a lot of dust. Sometimes it's better to just sell, move closer to the city. My office can help you with the paperwork, speed things up." Samira looked into his eyes. For 40 years, she saw a family friend. Now she saw the man who had sat in a getaway car while her parents burned. She saw the man who Elias had kept in a cage for 4 decades. And now that Elias was gone, the cage door was wide open. "I'm not going anywhere, Julian," Samira said, her voice regaining its teacher tone, stern, unyielding. "I think I'm finally starting to understand the history of this house." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "History is a dangerous thing to dig up, Samira. Sometimes it's best to let the dead stay buried." He set the muffins on the side table. "I'll be checking in on you. Frequently." As Julian left, Samira locked the door with a trembling hand. She ran back to the study and grabbed the Sony recorder. She looked at the other tapes. One tape was marked with red ink. "If I don't wake up." She pressed play. Elias's voice sounding ragged and terrified. "Samira, if you're hearing this, Julian has found out about my heart medication. He's been asking too many questions. I've hidden the final proof, the black box, in the place where we first said, 'I love you.' Find it. It's the only weapon you have left. And Samira, I'm sorry for the lie. I hope one day you realize I did love Margot, even if I had to kill Samira to keep her." Outside, a black sedan sat idling at the end of her driveway. The headlights were off, but she could see the silhouette of a man watching her window. The hunt had begun. The black sedan at the edge of the driveway didn't move. Its engine hummed, a low mechanical growl that vibrated through the glass of the study window. Samira stood in the darkness, her fingers clutching the Sony recorder so hard the plastic bit into her palm. She was Margot Hines, the girl from the fire, the girl whose life had been bought and paid for by a man she thought was her soulmate. "I am not a project," she whispered, her voice cracking the silence. "I am a person." She looked at the floorboards she had just pried up. If Julian knew about the recorder, he'd be through that door in seconds. But Julian was a man of propriety. In Oak Ridge, you didn't break into a widow's house while the neighbors were still awake. You waited for the accident. You waited for the heart to fail, or the stove to leak, or the brakes to hiss and die on a mountain road. Samira grabbed a canvas tote bag. She stuffed the microcassettes, the Phoenix folder, and Elias's old 9mm pistol, cold and heavy, into the bottom, hidden beneath a layer of old Sunday school hymnals. She needed to find the black box, the place where we first said I love you. Samira sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the refrigerator light her only companion. She closed her eyes, forcing her mind back 40 years. They had met at a university gala in Richmond. He was a rising star in law. She was a young student teacher. But they hadn't said it there. Not at the gala, not at the fancy French restaurant on their third date. She remembered a rainy Tuesday in 1983. They were driving back from a rally in Prince Edward County. The car had overheated near an old abandoned bridge, the Tallahatchie Crossing. They had sat on the hood of the car, watching the lightning strike the river, sharing a thermos of lukewarm coffee. "I don't just admire you, Samira," Elias had said, his eyes reflecting the storm. "I need you. I love you." It was a beautiful memory. Now it felt like a crime scene. The Tallahatchie Crossing was 12 miles away, deep in the Pine Barrens. It was a place where the cell signal died, and the ghosts of the Old South lived in the trees. If Julian was watching her, she couldn't just drive there. She had to be smarter. Samira picked up her landline. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Marcus, it's Mrs. Vance. I'm so sorry to call this late." Marcus Sterling, Julian's son, answered on the second ring. His voice was warm, tinged with the respectful tone he always used with her. "Mrs. Vance, is everything okay? My dad just mentioned he stopped by with some muffins." I had a bit of a fall, Marcus. Nothing broken, but I've got a leak in the upstairs bathroom and I can't reach the shut-off valve. I didn't want to bother your father again. He's so busy with the sheriff's department." "I'll be right over, Mrs. Vance. Don't move." Samira hung up. She felt a pang of guilt. Marcus was a good boy. He had been a star pupil in her AP history class. He was the only Sterling who seemed to have a conscience. But in war, you used the pieces you had. When Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, Samira met him at the door in her bathrobe, looking every bit the fragile, confused elder. "It's the guest bath, honey," she said, pointing upstairs. While Marcus was busy wrestling with the plumbing on the second floor, Samira slipped out the back mudroom. She didn't take her car. She took Elias's old, beat-up farm truck parked in the shed, the one Julian wouldn't expect her to drive. She coasted down the grass verge, lights off, until she hit the main road a quarter-mile away. In the rearview mirror, she saw the lights of the black sedan suddenly flare. It began to follow, but it followed her BMW, still sitting in the driveway, where she had left a mannequin from her sewing room draped in a cardigan near the window. She had 20 minutes, maybe less. The old bridge was a skeletal remain of rusted iron and rotting timber. The river below rushed with the spring rains, a black ribbon of churning water. Samira parked the truck in a thicket of weeping willows and stepped out. The air was freezing. She carried a heavy flashlight and a crowbar. "Where is it, Elias? Where did you hide the truth?" She walked to the center of the bridge. This was where they had stood. She looked at the iron girders. Nothing. She looked at the stone pilings. Then she saw it. On the third piling, etched into the stone, was that same symbol, the phoenix rising from thorns. It was carved low, near the waterline. Samira climbed down the slippery embankment, her boots sinking into the mud. She reached behind a loose stone in the piling. Her fingers brushed against cold plastic. She pulled out a waterproof Pelican case. Inside wasn't just another tape. It was a digital hard drive and a stack of letters. And at the very top, a photograph of a woman Samira hadn't seen in 4 decades. her mother, Sarah Hines. But the photo wasn't from 1968. The woman in the photo was older, much older. She was sitting in a wheelchair in a sunlit garden, her eyes vacant, wearing a hospital gown. The date on the back of the photo was August 2025. "She's alive," Samira choked out. The breath left her lungs. "You kept her alive and you never told me." "She wouldn't have recognized you anyway, Samira." The voice came from the top of the embankment. Samira looked up. Julian Sterling stood there. He wasn't wearing his sheriff's uniform anymore. He wore a dark hunting jacket. He held a high-powered flashlight in one hand and a suppressed pistol in the other. "Elias was a sentimental fool," Julian said, his voice echoing under the bridge. "He thought he could pay for a murder with a marriage. He thought if he kept you in that house, he could balance the scales. But the scales are broken, Samira." "You killed him," Samira said, standing her ground in the mud, the pelican case clutched to her chest. "You poisoned my husband." Elias was getting weak. He started talking about confession. He wanted to take you to see Sarah. He wanted to give you the Hines name back. Julian stepped down the embankment, the mud barely splashing his polished boots. "I couldn't let that happen. My family name is worth more than your family's ghost." "Your son is at my house right now, Julian," Samira bluffed, her voice steel. "He knows everything." Julian paused, a flicker of something. Doubt? Rage? Crossing his face. Then he laughed. "Marcus? Marcus is a Sterling. He'll do what he's told once I explain the stakes. Now give me the drive." "No!" Julian raised the gun. "I don't want to do this, Samira. You were a good teacher. You taught my kids. But you're a liability now. You're the only thing left of 1968. "I am the fire you couldn't put out," Samira said. She didn't run. She didn't scream. Instead, she reached into her tote bag. She didn't pull out the gun. She wasn't a killer. She pulled out the Sony recorder and pressed play at maximum volume. Elias's voice boomed out, amplified by the iron structure of the bridge. Julian Sterling didn't just drive the car. He poured the gasoline. He watched the child run, and he laughed. "I have his father's confession on the second drive. If I die, the truth goes to the Attorney General." The recording was a fake, a splice she had made earlier using Elias's old trial notes. But Julian didn't know that. He lunged at her, his composure breaking. Samira swung the heavy metal crowbar. It connected with Julian's shoulder with a sickening crack. He roared in pain, dropping the gun into the rushing river. Samira scrambled up the embankment, her lungs burning. She jumped into the farm truck, slammed it into gear, and floored it. In the rear view, Julian was a dark shape in the mud, screaming into a radio. He wasn't a sheriff anymore. He was a cornered animal. Samira drove until the truck ran nearly out of gas. She didn't go home. Home was a trap. She drove to the Ebenezer Baptist Church in the heart of the Black District. The doors were always open. The sanctuary was dark, smelling of floor wax and old hymnals. She sat in the front pew, the pelican case in her lap. She opened the drive on Elias's old laptop, which she'd taken from the mudroom. Files scrolled past. The Sterling payroll, the Brennan cover-up, the mayor's debt. But then she found a folder titled, The Doctor. She opened it. Inside were medical records from the Greenhaven Sanitarium. Patient, Sarah Hines. Admitted May 1968. Guardian of record, Dr. Arthur Vance, Thomas's father. They hadn't just killed her father and burned her home. They had stolen her mother and turned her into a prisoner of the state, using mental illness as a cage to keep the truth from ever being told. And the man treating her? Dr. Richard Brennan, the son of the fire inspector. The entire town was a conspiracy of sons protecting the sins of their fathers. Samira realized then that she couldn't just run. She couldn't just go to the police. The police were the Sterlings. She couldn't go to the hospital. The hospital was the Brennans. She looked at the laptop screen. She looked at her mother's vacant eyes. "They think I'm a teacher," Samira said to the empty church. "They think I'm a widow." She began to type. She began to organize the files. Not for a court of law, but for a court of public opinion. She began to draft a lesson plan for the town of Oak Ridge. Assignment 1, the truth. As the sun began to peek through the stained glass, Samira found one final file on the drive. It was a video file, dated only a month ago. She clicked play. It was a shaky cell phone video. It appeared to have been taken by a nurse. In the video, her mother, Sarah, was staring out a window. Suddenly, she turned to the camera. Her eyes weren't vacant. They were sharp, piercing. "I know you're watching, Elias," Sarah said, her voice a raspy whisper. "I know you think you're keeping her safe, but my daughter wasn't born to be kept. She was born to lead. Tell Margot. Tell her the fire is still burning. Tell her to look at the roses." The video cut to black. Look at the roses. Samira looked at her hands. She had a tattoo on her wrist, a small faded rose she'd gotten when she turned 18. She had always thought it was just a random choice. Now she remembered. Her mother used to tuck a rose behind her ear every Sunday. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a signal. A shadow fell across the church door. Samira reached for Elias's gun, but it wasn't Julian. It was Marcus Sterling. He was drenched in rain, his face pale. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding his father's badge. "I found the mannequins, Mrs. Vance," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "And I found my father's medical files in your study, the ones about the poison." He walked down the aisle, his boots echoing. "He's coming here. He's called in the whole department. He's telling them you've had a mental breakdown and you're armed and dangerous." Marcus stopped 5 feet away. "I'm not a Sterling, Mrs. Vance. Not tonight. Tell me what to do." Samira looked at her former student. She saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw the spark of justice she had tried to instill in him for years. "The truth is a heavy burden, Marcus," she said. "Are you ready to carry it?" "I've been carrying my father's lies my whole life," he said. "I'm ready to be light." "Good," Samira said, turning the laptop toward him. "Because we're about to go live." Outside, the sirens began to wail. Blue and red lights began to dance against the stained glass of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Julian's voice came over the megaphone. "Samira Vance, this is Sheriff Sterling. Put the weapon down and come out with your hands up. We're here to help you." Samira looked at Marcus. She looked at the pelican case. "Class is in session," she said. The blue and red lights of the Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department pulsed against the stained glass windows of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, turning the depictions of saints into shivering ghosts of neon. Outside, the rain had turned into a mist that clung to the uniforms of the 12 deputies surrounding the perimeter. "Samira Vance!" Julian's voice boomed again, amplified by the squad car's megaphone. It was distorted, mechanical, stripped of the neighborly warmth he had used for years. "We know you're distressed. We know Elias's death has been hard. Just come out, honey. Let's get you some help." Inside the darkened sanctuary, Samira sat at the small wooden desk usually reserved for the pastor's guest book. Marcus stood by the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. "He's got 4 units out front," Marcus whispered, his voice tight. 2 more in the alley. They're wearing tactical vests, Mrs. Vance. My father isn't here to help you. He's here to end the conversation." Samira didn't look up. Her fingers were flying across the laptop keyboard. "In history, Marcus, the winner isn't the one with the biggest gun. It's the one who controls the narrative. Your father thinks he's in a standoff. He doesn't realize he's in a broadcast." "What are you doing?" "Oak Ridge is a small town, Marcus. We're traditional. We still have a community radio station, and every squad car, every kitchen radio, and every bedside alarm is tuned to 98.7 FM for the morning weather report." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. Elias was a blackmailer, but he was also a genius. He installed a pirate transmitter in the bell tower of this church 10 years ago. He called it his dead man's switch. He told me it was for emergencies. I think this qualifies. She hit enter. Outside, Julian Sterling checked his watch. He leaned over to his sergeant, a man named Miller, whose father had been on the original clearing crew in 1968. "Give her 2 more minutes," Julian hissed. "Then we breach the side door. If she reaches for that bag, you don't hesitate. She's confused and armed. Understood?" Suddenly, the radio in Miller's shoulder piece crackled to life. It wasn't the dispatcher. "People of Oak Ridge," a voice said. It was calm, deep. The voice of a woman who had spent 30 years commanding respect in a classroom. Julian froze. He reached into his patrol car and turned up the volume. The same voice was coming through every speaker in the fleet. My name is Samira Vance. Many of you know me as your teacher. Some of you knew me as the wife of Elias Vance. But my birth name is Margot Hines. And 40 years ago, a fire was set in Georgia to hide a crime. The men who set that fire didn't go to jail. They came to this town. They became your sheriff. They became your mayor. They became your doctors. Shut it down, Julian screamed, lunging for his radio. Find where that signal is coming from and cut the power. But it was too late. Samira began to play the clips. The town heard Julian's father confessing to the arson. They heard Dr. Brennan discussing the sedation levels for Sarah Hines. And finally they heard the recording Samira had made at the bridge. Julian's own voice, raw and murderous, admitting to poisoning Elias. The shift didn't happen with a bang, but with a slow, heavy movement of the shadows. From the houses surrounding the church, the small, neatly kept homes of the Black District, lights began to flip on. Porch doors creaked open. One by one, people began to walk toward the church. These weren't strangers. These were Samira's neighbors. They were the deacons of the church. They were the young men she had tutored in algebra. They were the mothers who had shared recipes with her at the grocery store. They didn't carry guns. They carried cell phones, their screens glowing like 1,000 tiny candles, all of them recording. Get back, Sergeant Miller shouted, his hand hovering over his holster as the crowd drew closer. This is an active police scene. An elderly man, Mr. Henderson, the town's retired mailman, stepped forward. We heard the radio, Miller. We heard what that boy's father did. You move on her, you move on all of us. Julian stood in the center of the street, his face contorted in a mask of fading power. He looked at the crowd. He saw the project he had tried to bury for 40 years standing on the steps of the church. Samira walked out onto the stone landing. She wasn't wearing a bathrobe anymore. She wore a dark, professional suit, her head wrap tied high like a crown. Marcus stood beside her, his badge pinned to his civilian jacket, his hand resting on the laptop containing the truth. The lesson is over, Julian, Samira said, her voice carrying over the silent crowd. The truth doesn't need a cage anymore. Julian laughed, a jagged, broken sound. You think a few recordings change anything? I'm the sheriff. My word is law. Those tapes are AI-generated fakes. I'll have you in a cell by morning. I thought you might say that, Samira said. She looked toward the end of the street. A silver medical transport van pulled into the light, escorted by 2 black SUVs with federal plates. Julian's face went gray. What is that? The van doors opened. A nurse stepped out, pushing a wheelchair. In the chair sat a woman with silver hair and eyes that looked like Samira's, Sarah Hines. Beside her stood an older woman in a sharp navy blazer, the state attorney general. Elias didn't just Tong Tien blackmail you, Julian, Samira said. He spent the last 6 months of his life working with the FBI's Civil Rights Cold Case Unit. He knew he was dying. He knew he couldn't protect me forever. So he turned himself in. He gave them everything, including his own father's crimes, in exchange for a full federal protection order for me and Sarah. The Attorney General stepped forward, her voice ringing out in the cold morning air. Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Elias Vance, and for the kidnapping and false imprisonment of Sarah Hines. Drop your weapon. Julian looked at his deputies. One by one they stepped away from him. Even Sergeant Miller lowered his head, the weight of the truth finally too heavy to ignore. Julian Sterling dropped his gun into the wet asphalt. He didn't look like a sheriff anymore. He looked like the frightened 17-year-old who had watched a house burn in 1968. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long golden light down Oak Street. The mist began to lift. Samira walked down the church steps. Her legs felt heavy, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. She walked past the federal agents, past the whispering crowd, until she stood in front of the wheelchair. Sarah Hines looked up. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the oaks. Then Sarah reached out a trembling hand. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Samira's forehead. "Margot?" she whispered. Samira knelt in the mud, pressing her face into her mother's lap. The scent of roses, faint but unmistakable, bloomed in the air. "I'm here, Mama," Samira sobbed. "I'm home." 3 months later, the Vance house was no longer a fortress of secrets. The hidden room had been physically removed, the wall replaced with a large bay window that overlooked the community garden. Samira sat at the desk in the new Heinz Vance Literacy Center. On the wall behind her was a photo of Elias. She had forgiven him in her own way. He was a flawed man who had done terrible things to protect a beautiful truth. She no longer lived in his cage, but she kept his memory as a reminder that love and guilt are often two sides of the same coin. Marcus Sterling was the acting sheriff now, leading a department undergoing a federal overhaul. He stopped by every Tuesday for tea. Samira picked up a pen and opened a new ledger. This one wasn't for blackmail. It was for the history of Oak Ridge, the real history, the one she was finally ready to teach. She looked at the tattoo of the rose on her wrist. It wasn't a mark of a victim anymore. It was a badge of the survivor. "Class," she whispered to the empty room as the first group of neighborhood children began to walk up the path. "Let's begin."